"Ma'am, I need you to step back from that gate." The words hit me like cold water. I looked up from my boarding pass and found a broad-shouldered man in a yellow safety vest staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not threatening. Not rude. Something closer to urgent. "Your flight to Chicago is still boarding. What's the problem?" He lowered his voice and leaned slightly toward me, glancing once over his shoulder. "I know this is going to sound strange, but I need you to trust me for about 4 minutes." I had been traveling alone since I was 32 years old. I had taken red-eye flights across the country, navigated 3 foreign airports with nothing but a paper map and a pocket dictionary, and once talked my way through a missed connection in Atlanta at 2 in the morning. I was not the kind of woman who scared easily. But something about the way he said "trust me" made my hand tighten around the strap of my carry-on. "4 minutes for what?" I said. He didn't answer right away. He pressed his radio to his chest so the static wouldn't carry, and he looked at me with the kind of steadiness you only see in people who have learned to stay calm when everything around them is not. "Please," he said. "Just 4 minutes." I stepped back from the gate. His name was Walter. I would learn that later. In those first 4 minutes, he was just a stranger in a yellow vest standing between me and the jet bridge, and I was just a 67-year-old woman from Sarasota, Florida, who had packed a week's worth of clothes into one rolling suitcase because my daughter had called 3 days ago and told me she needed me, that she was scared, that things with Kevin had gotten worse. I had booked the flight before she finished the sentence. My daughter Sandra had met Kevin Hargrove at a conference in Indianapolis 6 years ago. She was 41, recently divorced, and I remember how her voice had changed when she first told me about him. Lighter, like something that had been pressing down on her had finally let up. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming effortlessly and therefore slightly dangerously. He knew what to say and when to say it, and he had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room right up until the moment he needed something from you. I had told myself I was being too suspicious. Sandra was smart. Sandra was careful. Sandra had a master's degree in social work, for heaven's sake. She knew the warning signs better than most people. But love has a way of making smart people look away from the things they don't want to see. The first time I noticed something off was Thanksgiving 2 years ago. Kevin had made a comment at the dinner table about my savings. Nothing dramatic, just a casual mention that real estate in Sarasota is underperforming and that I should think about restructuring. I had laughed it off and changed the subject. Sandra had looked at her plate. Later, washing dishes, she told me not to mind him. He was just passionate about finances. I had let it go. I wish now, with everything in me, that I hadn't. "Your daughter called the airline this morning," Walter said, still keeping his voice low. We were standing near a pillar, away from the flow of passengers. "She called the customer service line and asked them to flag your reservation. She wanted to be notified when you checked in." I stared at him. "Sandra called the airline?" "Not Sandra." He paused. "Someone called identifying themselves as your daughter. They said you had a medical condition that made solo travel unsafe. They asked the gate agent to hold you until a family member arrived to escort you." The floor felt slightly unsteady beneath me. "I don't have any medical condition." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm talking to you." What happened next came out in pieces. The way things do when someone is telling you something they know will hurt you, and they're trying to soften each word as much as they can without losing the truth of it. Walter had been working at O'Hare. This was his home gate, where he'd transferred me to after my arriving flight for 11 years. His sister had gone through something similar 5 years ago. A husband who had slowly, methodically, begun constructing a version of her that existed on paper, a woman who was confused, unstable, unable to manage her own affairs. By the time his sister realized what was happening, there were documents she didn't remember signing. A revised will. A power of attorney that had her signature on it, and she could not say with certainty when or how she had signed it. "I'm not saying that's what's happening here," Walter told me. "I'm saying the call this morning felt wrong. And in my experience, when something feels wrong, it usually is." My carry-on handle was still extended. I hadn't let go of it. I looked down at my hand and made myself loosen my grip, finger by finger, because I needed to think clearly, and I could not think clearly while every muscle in my body was locked. "Where's my daughter right now?" I asked. "I don't know," he said. "But whoever called this morning said they would be at the airport within the hour to pick you up." It was 9:40 in the morning. My flight had landed 40 minutes ago. I thought about Sandra's voice on the phone 3 days ago. The pauses between her sentences that were longer than they should have been. The way she had said things with Kevin have gotten worse, and then immediately said, "But don't worry, just come. I just need you here." I had heard something underneath those words that I didn't let myself name at the time. I was naming it now. She hadn't sounded scared of a situation. She had sounded scared of a person. I asked Walter if I could sit down. He walked me to a row of seats near the window, away from the gate, and stood close enough that I didn't feel alone but far enough that I could breathe. Outside, a plane was pushing back from the next jetway. The sky over Chicago was the flat white of February, the kind of sky that gives nothing away. I called Sandra. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording was cheerful in the way of something recorded a long time ago, before whatever had changed had changed. "You've reached Sandra. Leave a message and I'll call you right back." I hung up and called again. Voicemail. I tried to think about the last time I had actually spoken to Sandra without Kevin somewhere in the background, not necessarily in the room but present. In the way that a room can feel occupied even when only one person is in it, because the other person has left enough of themselves behind that you can feel the shape of them. The last truly private conversation I could recall was 8 months ago, when she called me from a parking lot while he was at the gym. She had cried for almost 10 minutes and then said she was fine and that she just missed me. I had flown down to visit 2 months later, and Kevin had been so warm and attentive the entire trip that I had wondered if I had imagined the parking lot phone call. I had not imagined it. "I need to get to her," I told Walter. He nodded. He had clearly expected this. "I can call you a car, but I want to show you something first." He pulled out his phone, careful, deliberate, and turned it to face me. On the screen was a photograph of a document. I had to lean in to read it, and when I did, the white February sky outside blurred at the edges of my vision. It was a medical evaluation form. My name was on it, Eleanor Patricia Marsh, my date of birth, my address in Sarasota. Under presenting concerns, someone had typed a list of symptoms: confusion, disorientation, inability to manage daily finances, potential early cognitive decline, and at the bottom was a signature line with a date from 6 weeks ago. I had not had a medical evaluation 6 weeks ago. I had not had any evaluation. I had been in Florida, tending my garden, and having coffee with my neighbor Ruthie every Thursday morning and driving myself to the farmer's market, as I had done every week for the last 12 years. "Where did you get this?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. "Someone faxed it to the airline this morning, along with the call. I don't think they expected anyone to actually look at it carefully." He pocketed his phone. "The form is from a facility in the suburbs, Meadowbrook Care Center." I looked it up. It's a memory care and assisted living complex. I sat with that for a moment. Meadowbrook Care Center. I said the name to myself and felt the cold of it. Not a nursing home someone chooses, the kind that chooses you. 11 months ago, Kevin had started talking about estate planning. Gently, reasonably, the way you talk about things you want to seem boring so the other person stops paying attention. He had brought in a financial advisor, a friend of his, a man named Douglas, with a firm handshake and a very expensive watch, who had sat across from me at Sandra's kitchen table and explained that at my age, with my assets, it was simply responsible to think about future arrangements. I had listened. I had not signed anything. Kevin had seemed mildly disappointed but had covered it with a smile. I thought about Douglas and his expensive watch, and I thought about that signature on the evaluation form, and I thought about the call to the airline, and something that had been building quietly in my chest for months finally became very clear and very cold and very certain. This had not happened overnight. This had been constructed, piece by piece, by someone who was patient and methodical and who believed that I was just an old woman in Florida who would eventually stop paying attention. I was paying attention now. The car, Walter called, got me to Sandra's neighborhood in 40 minutes. I did not go to the front door. I sat in the back seat of that car and I thought about what Sandra had said on the phone. "I just need you here," and I thought about the evaluation form, and I thought about Walter's sister, and then I called Ruthie. Ruthie had been my neighbor for 19 years. She was 74 and had outlasted 2 difficult husbands and 1 hostile corporate takeover of the nonprofit she'd founded. and she was the kind of woman who kept the number of a good lawyer the way other people keep the number of a good plumber. Readily available and entirely unsentimental about when to use it. "I need the name of that attorney," I told her. "The one you used for the property dispute." There was a brief silence. Ruthie did not ask unnecessary questions. "His name is Arthur Pellegrino," she said. "I'll text you his cell number. Eleanor, are you all right?" "I will be," I said. "I think I will be." I had the driver stop around the corner from Sandra's house. I needed one more minute. I needed to organize what I knew and what I suspected and what I could prove, because walking into that house without that clarity would help no one. Least of all Sandra. What I knew. Someone had filed a fabricated medical evaluation with my name on it. Someone had called the airline to have me detained. That someone had access to my personal information, my full name, date of birth, home address. The form had come from a facility Kevin had likely researched. Kevin had previously tried to involve me in financial arrangements that I had declined. What I suspected, Sandra was not a willing participant. The phone call 3 days ago, "I'm scared. Things have gotten worse," had been a genuine cry for help. Whatever Kevin was planning, she either knew too much or had begun to push back. What I could prove? Nothing yet. But I was 67 years old and I had spent 30 years as a paralegal before I retired, and I knew the difference between suspicion and evidence, and I knew that evidence could be built if you moved carefully. I got out of the car. Sandra's house was a craftsman bungalow on a quiet street in Oak Park, the kind of neighborhood where the houses have front porches and the trees are old enough to make a canopy over the road in summer. In February it looked stripped and exposed, the bare branches casting thin shadows across the frozen lawn. Kevin's car was in the driveway. A second car I didn't recognize was parked at the curb. I went to the front door and knocked. Kevin opened it. He was dressed well, as he always was, pressed shirt, dark trousers, the careful presentation of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. His expression, when he saw me, moved through several phases in about 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, and then the smile that had always reminded me of a door swinging open to reveal a room you weren't sure you wanted to enter. "Eleanor," he said. "We weren't expecting you until this afternoon." "I caught an earlier flight," I said. Which was not exactly a lie, because I had indeed caught an earlier flight, just not in the way he meant. "Is Sandra home?" "She's resting. She hasn't been feeling well." He did not move away from the doorway. "You should have let us know. We would have picked you up." "I didn't want to be any trouble," I said pleasantly. There was a brief and very loaded pause. Then he stepped back and let me in. The man I didn't recognize was sitting in the living room. Mid-50s, gray suit, a soft leather briefcase open on the coffee table. He stood when I came in, the automatic courtesy of someone trained in professional settings. Kevin said his name was Gregory and that he was a financial consultant. Gregory shook my hand and smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. On the coffee table, next to the open briefcase, was a folder. I could see the edge of a document inside it. The paper had the slight off-white tint of legal stationery. "Sandra?" I called out, toward the hallway. "Mom?" Her voice came from the back of the house, muffled, like she was behind a closed door. "Why don't we sit down?" Kevin said. Gregory was just about to explain a few things. "Since you're here, it might be good for you to hear it." I looked at him. I looked at Gregory. I looked at the briefcase and the folder with the legal-sized document. And then I said, very calmly, "I think I'll go check on Sandra first." Kevin's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. Something tightened. "She really just needs rest, Eleanor. She's been under a lot of stress." "I'm sure she has been," I said. And I walked down the hallway. Sandra was in the bedroom. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap, and she was still in her pajamas at 11 in the morning, and when she saw me, she made a sound I had not heard from her since she was a little girl. Something that started as my name and ended as something else entirely: relief or release, or the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time. I closed the door behind me and sat next to her and didn't say anything for a moment, just put my arm around her and let her breathe. "He said you weren't coming until tonight," she said. "He said he was going to pick you up, and Mom, I found papers. Last week, in his desk. There were papers with your name on them. And mine." Her voice was low and rapid, the voice of someone who has been waiting to say something and is terrified of being overheard. There was an evaluation form and it said power of attorney and conservatorship, and I asked him what it was and he said it was just preliminary planning, just in case, I know, I said. She looked at me. You know? A man at the airport showed me a copy of the evaluation form this morning. Someone sent it to the airline. They were trying to have me held until Kevin arrived. The color left her face. She looked younger than she had in years and also suddenly terribly older. Sandra, I said, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Did you sign anything? Any document that Kevin showed you? Any form? Anything that Gregory or any other consultant brought to you? There was something. 3 weeks ago. He said it was a medical proxy form, in case of emergency. He said it was standard. He said every couple had one. Okay. I kept my voice even. Do you know where that document is now? His desk. Or Gregory has it, maybe. Gregory has been here twice this week. I thought about Arthur Pellegrino's phone number sitting in a text from Ruthie, and I thought about the 30 years I had spent reading contracts and depositions and all the ways that legal language could be constructed to say one thing while meaning another, and I thought about Walter at the airport, standing between me and the jet bridge for 4 minutes because he recognized something wrong when he saw it. Here's what we're going to do, I told my daughter. I will not pretend that the next several hours were simple. They were not. What followed was the kind of conversation that strips away everything comfortable and leaves you standing in a room with the bare walls of what is actually true. Kevin, when he understood that I knew what the documents were and that I was not going to sit down and listen to Gregory explain a thing, became very still in the way that certain men become still when they realize the script has changed. He tried 3 different approaches in about 20 minutes: conciliation, then mild condescension, then a version of concern so manufactured it was almost insulting. I had been a paralegal for 30 years. I had sat across from people like Gregory in conference rooms more times than I could count. I knew the difference between a professional who was doing his job and a professional who knew he was there for a purpose that would not survive being said out loud. I called Arthur Pellegrino from Sandra's kitchen while Kevin and Gregory were in the living room. Arthur had been recommended to Ruthie during a property dispute that had gotten ugly, and Ruthie had described him as the kind of attorney who doesn't get loud because he doesn't need to. He answered on the second ring, and I explained the situation in about 4 minutes. There was a brief silence when I finished. Do not sign anything, he said. Do not let your daughter sign anything. Get photographs of any documents you can access. I can be in Oak Park by 3 o'clock. I'll be here, I said. When I came back into the living room, Kevin was standing near the window. Gregory had closed his briefcase. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence had the texture of something that had been rearranged in the few minutes I was out of the room. Eleanor, Kevin said, in the tone people use when they are about to say something they need to sound reasonable. I think there's been a misunderstanding. The paperwork Gregory brought is simply... Kevin, I said. I kept my voice the way Arthur's had been. Not loud, because I didn't need it to be. An attorney will be here at 3 o'clock. I think it would be best if Gregory left before then. And I think it would be best if you and I waited until the attorney arrived to have any further conversation about paperwork. Gregory looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at me. Something moved across his face, not the practiced charm, not the careful smile, but something underneath all of that, something that was older and plainer and a great deal less impressive. He was a man who had built a very elaborate structure on the assumption that no one would look at it directly, and someone was looking at it directly now. Gregory picked up his briefcase. He said something brief and professional about rescheduling, and he left without making eye contact with anyone. Sandra came out of the hallway while the front door was still closing. She looked at Kevin, and then at me, and then back at Kevin. And she stood very straight, in a way I recognized the way she had stood when she was 12, and had decided she wasn't going to be frightened of something anymore, even if she still was. Arthur Pellegrino arrived at 2:57. He was in his late 50s, compact and unhurried, with the kind of calm that is not the absence of urgency but the management of it. Kevin, to his credit or perhaps to his survival instinct, did not try the charm. He sat across from Arthur and he answered questions, and when Arthur asked about the conservatorship documentation, Kevin said that he hadn't filed anything and it had only been preliminary and there had been no intent. The evaluation form was sent to the airline this morning, Arthur said, without inflection. Kevin said nothing. A fax with Eleanor's full name, date of birth, and home address, attached to a call identifying the sender as Sandra Hargrove, requesting that Eleanor be detained until family could arrive. Arthur looked at Kevin with a kind of professional patience that was more unsettling than any anger would have been. That's not preliminary, that's an action. What followed was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. It was quieter and in some ways more awful than drama, the slow collapse of a pretense, as it becomes clear that the pretense cannot be maintained. Kevin said very little. What he did say, in the end, was that he had been trying to protect Sandra, that he was worried about Eleanor's capacity, that he had only been thinking about the family's long-term security. Sandra, who had been sitting beside me, said, "You were thinking about the money, Kevin." She said it without shouting, without crying. She said it the way you say a thing once you have already known it for a long time and are finally willing to say it out loud. The room went very quiet. I looked at my daughter in that quiet, my daughter who had called me from a parking lot 8 months ago and cried for 10 minutes, who had used the word scared on the phone 3 days ago, who had been sitting on the edge of a bed in her pajamas at 11 in the morning when I arrived, and I thought about all the ways we look away from things because looking at them means having to act, and all the ways that looking away is its own kind of cost. Arthur handled the practical matters with quiet efficiency. The documents Gregory had brought were not legally binding, they had not been signed, and the evaluation form, when examined, contained procedural irregularities that made it unenforceable. Kevin had, in the legal sense, not yet done anything that could not be walked back. But Arthur was thorough, and he was clear about what would happen if anything further was attempted, and when he left that evening, he had given Sandra the name of a colleague who specialized in family law. Kevin left that night. Sandra called me from the driveway an hour after he drove away, and she was crying, but not the way she had cried on the phone from the parking lot. That had been the crying of someone who sees the problem and can't find the exit. This was something else. The crying of someone standing in the open air. I stayed for 10 days. On the 3rd day, Sandra and I drove out to Meadowbrook Care Center. Not to do anything, there was nothing to do there. Not legally, not yet. We just drove past it, because I needed to see it. It was a beige building set back from the road, with a sign in formal blue letters and a parking lot that was mostly empty on a Tuesday morning. It looked like 100 other buildings. It looked quiet. We sat in the car in the parking lot across the street, and I thought about Eleanor Patricia Marsh's name on that evaluation form, about Douglas and his expensive watch at Sandra's kitchen table 11 months ago. About the way something can be built around you so gradually that by the time you see the walls, they seem like they were always there. "How long do you think he was planning this?" Sandra asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Long enough to be patient about it. That's the part that matters." She was quiet for a moment. "I should have called you sooner." "You called me when you could," I said, "and I meant it. These things are not simple. Knowing and admitting and asking for help are 3 different things, and they do not always happen at the same time, and I had not always been as good as I could have been at making it easy for Sandra to ask." I looked at the beige building across the street, and I thought about Walter at the airport, in his yellow vest, telling me to trust him for 4 minutes. I had asked him, later, how he had known to say something. He had shrugged with the slight embarrassment of someone who doesn't think of himself as particularly heroic. "My sister," he said. "I promised her that if I ever saw it, I wouldn't look away." I had not looked away. Neither had he. And sometimes that is the whole difference. On the last morning before I flew home, Sandra made coffee, and we sat on her front porch in the weak March sunlight, wrapped in blankets, the way we used to sit on Saturday mornings when she was a teenager, and neither of us wanted to talk about anything serious, and so we talked about everything else. The neighbor's dog, the crocuses coming up through the frost at the edge of the yard, a bird we couldn't identify in the oak tree at the corner. "I was thinking," Sandra said eventually, "about coming down to Sarasota this summer. Spending a few weeks." "Ruthie will be thrilled," I said. "She's been asking about you." Sandra smiled. "The real one. The one I had not seen enough of in the past few years. Tell her I'll bring the good coffee." I flew home on a Tuesday. I drove myself from the airport. I stopped at the farmer's market on the way, because it was Tuesday and that's what I did on Tuesdays, and I bought tomatoes and a bundle of rosemary and a small jar of local honey, and I talked to the man who sold citrus for about 10 minutes about his grandchildren. Then I drove home and unloaded my suitcase and sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the silence of my own house around me, the good kind of silence, the kind you choose. I thought about what I would tell people if they asked how the trip was. Fine, I imagined saying. Complicated, necessary. The best ones usually are. I thought about writing Walter a note. I had his name from the airline I had asked before I left O'Hare, and someone had been kind enough to pass it along. I wanted to tell him that his 4 minutes had mattered, that his sister's story had mattered, even the painful parts of it, maybe especially the painful parts, because they had made him the kind of person who stays alert when something feels wrong. I had been afraid, in those first 4 minutes, by the pillar, that I was being foolish. That I was a woman who scared easily, who saw danger where there was none, who was already becoming the confused and uncertain person that someone had tried to put on paper. I had been afraid that the story Kevin was building would be the one that stuck. But I was Eleanor Patricia Marsh. I had raised a daughter alone after her father left. I had worked 30 years in law and learned to read between the lines of things. I had traveled alone since I was 32 and navigated airports in 3 countries and talked my way through a missed connection in Atlanta at 2 in the morning. I knew who I was, and I knew, that morning at O'Hare, that the story someone else was writing was not mine. That evening, I called Sandra to tell her I was home safe. She answered on the first ring. "I was just thinking about you," she said. "Good thoughts, I hope," I said. "Always," she said. "Mom, thank you. There are things you carry with you from experiences like this one. Some of them are heavy, and some of them are not. What I carry is this: the knowledge that the people who love you do not always know how to say so, and that love in return sometimes means showing up before you are asked, and standing your ground when someone else would rather you didn't, and trusting a stranger in a yellow vest who tells you that 4 minutes matters. It does. It always does."